Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. Sergei Krikalev, when he was sent into space in 1991 to serve aboard the Mir space station during the final years of the Soviet Union, no one could have predicted that he would go on to make history by demonstrating how long a human could survive in space. The last years of the Soviet Union were marked by economic and political challenges, but the space program continued to be a source of pride for the Soviet Union. Krikalev, one of the most experienced cosmonauts of the Soviet space program, was entrusted with a mission that would place a tremendous responsibility on his shoulders in the vastness of space. When the Soviet Union's space program began with Yuri Gagarin's launch into space in the early 1960s, it captured global attention. The Soviets were locked in fierce competition with the Americans in space exploration, and they made significant investments to come out on top in this race. However, by the late 1980s, economic issues and political uncertainties began to affect the Soviet space program. Projects such as the construction and operation of the Mir space station were draining the rapidly depleting resources of the Soviet government. Launched in 1986, the Mir space station was one of the Soviet Union's biggest projects in space exploration. Mir was designed to allow cosmonauts to gain experience in long-term space missions. For experienced cosmonauts like Krikalev, this program was extremely important, as it helped to enhance the ability to conduct human research in space. The long-duration missions aboard Mir tested the physical and psychological limits of the cosmonauts. Sergei Krikalev was a distinguished member of the Soviet cosmonaut program. Born in 1958, Krikalev began his cosmonaut training in 1985, quickly achieving great success in his specialized fields. With each space mission, his technical and operational skills grew rapidly. Krikalev was selected as one of the few cosmonauts to undertake a mission aboard the Mir space station. This mission marked a significant turning point in his career. During the mission preparations, Krikalev underwent an intensive training process. He had to learn every corner of the space station and become familiar with even the smallest details of the equipment. The tasks aboard Mir were diverse. Each one required the ability to sustain human life in space for extended periods. Krikalev's focus was on managing the station's infrastructure, repairing system malfunctions, and conducting new scientific research in space. Sergei Krikalev was launched into space in March 1991 aboard the Soyuz TM-12 spacecraft. The Soyuz rocket was one of the Soviet Union's most reliable space vehicles, giving Krikalev confidence as he embarked on his mission. After a 2-day journey to the Mir station, Krikalev and the other crew members successfully docked with the station. Although Krikalev had seen the working environment aboard Mir during his training, the unique challenges of staying in space for extended periods became much more evident once he arrived. The initial plan was for Krikalev to stay for 3 months, but this period was extended multiple times. During Krikalev's time in space, the Soviet Union was rapidly disintegrating. By 1991, the country was undergoing significant political, economic, and social transformations. In December, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, and 15 independent republics were established. These events created serious uncertainties regarding Krikalev's return to Earth. As he continued his mission aboard Mir, Krikalev was unaware of the massive changes taking place on Earth. Being in space effectively cut him off from the world's events. Communication issues and uncertainties left Krikalev, in a sense, alone in space. The collapse of the Soviet Union directly impacted Krikalev's return to Earth. The newly established Russian government faced serious financial difficulties in continuing the space program. Due to the lack of funds, the necessary spacecraft and logistical support to bring Krikalev back were not available. This situation marked the beginning of a series of events that would leave Krikalev stranded in space. While continuing his mission in space, Krikalev, along with the other cosmonauts aboard Mir, had to maintain the station. As time passed, the effects of the Soviet Union's collapse were felt not only by the government but also by the space program, which was being depleted. Despite the challenges, Krikalev kept working diligently to complete his mission and find a way to reconnect with Earth. Ultimately, the time Sergei Krikalev spent in space, combined with the effects of the collapse of the Soviet Union, turned into a story that would go down in history. During this period, Krikalev's patience, skills, and courage demonstrated to the world how effectively a human could utilize their time in space. When Sergei Krikalev was sent into space in 1991, a great storm was brewing within the Soviet Union. However, Krikalev was completely unaware of these political upheavals. In space, serving aboard the Mir space station, he focused entirely on his mission, scientific research, and life in space. His experience during the collapse of the Soviet Union would become one of the most fascinating and tragic events in human history. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was entering a severe economic crisis. The economic difficulties stemmed from the unsustainable socialist policies of the government. Additionally, the introduction of reform movements such as glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, had created widespread dissatisfaction and chaos among the people. The Soviet Union's official ideology and centralized governance struggled to withstand the pressure from various segments of society. The year 1991 became a crucial year for the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1991, an attempted coup against Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev took place. However, the coup failed, and the collapse of the Soviet Union became inevitable. In December 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, and 15 independent republics were formed. This process marked the end of an era in Soviet history and the beginning of a new age. When Krikalev was launched into space, the Soviet Union was still a superpower. However, during his time in space, significant changes were taking place on Earth. While Krikalev was aboard the Mir space station, communication with Earth was extremely limited. He was unaware of the political events occurring back home, and throughout his time in space, he was mostly busy with the routine tasks aboard the station, with little opportunity to learn about the developments on Earth. On Mir, Krikalev and the other cosmonauts efficiently used their time performing maintenance on the station, conducting experiments and carrying out scientific research tasks. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the significant changes on Earth gradually weakened Krikalev's connection to the world and left him feeling increasingly isolated. During his time in space, Krikalev's communication with Earth was very limited. The cosmonauts aboard the Mir space station relied solely on specific satellite systems for communication. This communication was primarily used to receive mission-related information, critical alerts, and coordinate with space agencies on Earth. However, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, these communication channels became increasingly unreliable. Krikalev and the other cosmonauts had a hard time learning about what was happening on Earth. As communication intervals grew longer, Krikalev felt more and more detached from the events on Earth. Throughout his stay in space, he was unaware that the Soviet Union was slowly disintegrating. Focused on his mission and the time he would spend in space, Krikalev remained far removed from the political turmoil on Earth. The collapse of the Soviet Union changed the global balance of power. The Soviet Union, once a major superpower, vanished almost overnight. 15 independent republics were formed, and Russia became the leader of this new independent structure. Gorbachev's leadership came to an end, and Boris Yeltsin became the first president of Russia. The disintegration of the Soviet Union marked the beginning of a new era for Russia. However, the effects of these changes were immediately felt in space. The collapse of the Soviet Union severely disrupted the functioning of the space program. During Krikalev's time in space, the Russian government had to integrate the Soviet Union Space Agency into the newly established Russian state. The Mir space station and other space programs fell into a major financial void following the breakup of the Soviet Union. Budgets for space research and the cosmonaut program were rapidly reduced by the new Russian government. The collapse of the Soviet Union also complicated Krikalev's return to Earth. While Krikalev was in space, there was great uncertainty among the former leaders of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin's government was struggling to manage the space program. Additionally, The new Russian government was facing significant economic difficulties and struggled to allocate the necessary funds to ensure Krikolev's return from the Mir space station. Since Krikalev couldn't communicate with Earth, he was unaware of the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, aboard the Mir station, he continued to work, with all his might, focusing solely on completing his mission and keeping himself safe. Unaware of the political turmoil on Earth, Krikalev continued his work in space, isolated in a sense, under an atmosphere of uncertainty. As the Soviet Union collapsed, Krikalev began to find himself trapped in space. Due to the fall of the Soviet government, no spacecraft could be sent to bring him back to Earth. Yet Krikalev's ability to continue his mission and maintain morale became symbolic of both the final years of the Soviet Union and the challenges of space exploration. He continued his work, isolated from the great changes and uncertainties on Earth, but gradually began to witness the end of the era. This period turned into a challenging, yet historically significant experience for Krikalev. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not just a political shift, but an event that reshaped one of humanity's most significant space missions. While Krikalev was alone in space, watching the collapse of the Soviet Union and the changing world, his connection to Earth weakened, and history began to be written. The collapse of the Soviet Union didn't just change the political map on Earth, it also deeply impacted the space program. This transformation ultimately led to Sergei Krikalev's entrapment in space. Krikalev's journey to space began with the launch of Soyuz TM-12 in March 1991. However, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, logistical and financial issues arose regarding his return to Earth. Krikalev remained stranded on the Mir space station far longer than originally planned. During this time, his loneliness, uncertainty, and determination to complete his mission became intertwined. When Krikalev was sent aboard Soyuz TM-12 to the Mir station in 1991, his mission was initially set to last 3 months. This was a typical duration for Soviet cosmonauts. The Mir station, designed for long-term space missions, was used as a laboratory, and Krikalev was expected to carry out scientific experiments, manage the station's infrastructure, and gather data for future space missions. However, the initial timeline for Krikalev's mission changed drastically following the collapse of the Soviet Union. The official dissolution of the Soviet Union didn't just lead to massive changes in domestic policy and the economy, but it also caused serious difficulties in funding space programs. As Krikalev's mission extended, the logistical support needed for his return became increasingly complicated. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the new Russian government faced significant challenges in every sector, including the space program. While Krikalev was in space, the space agency inherited from the Soviet Union was placed under the control of the new Russian government. However, this new government lacked the financial resources to fund the space program. Russia's economy was in a deep crisis. Industries had collapsed, infrastructure issues arose, and budgets were severely cut. The resources needed to send the spacecraft to bring Krikalev back to Earth could not be provided by the new government. The collapse of the Soviet Union had also nearly wiped out the funding for state-sponsored space research. As a result, Russia needed to find an urgent solution for the launch of the Soyuz spacecraft, intended for Krikalev's return. But this was far from easy. Krikalev was left on the Mir station with only a small group of cosmonauts. However, this isolation deepened as the Soviet Union collapsed. The Soviet Union's communication infrastructure was also largely broken. During his time in space, Krikalev gradually began to lose his connection to Earth. News from Earth or any communication events became nearly impossible. Only limited communication was possible for technical support, station operations, and space mission tasks. Krikalev was completely unaware of the major political changes on Earth, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the decisions being made by the new Russian government. While Krikalev was stranded on the Mir space station, he was completely unaware of the chaotic atmosphere that accompanied the collapse of the Soviet Union. Apart from the lack of communication with Earth, dealing with problems related to the station's systems, managing basic needs like energy and water supply, and ensuring Everything functioned properly was an incredibly difficult task. In this environment, Krikalev had to focus all his concentration on his mission to continue scientific research and maintain the proper operation of the station. Krikalev's return went far beyond the initial plans of 1991. What was supposed to be a 3-month mission turned into several additional months after Krikalev spent his time fixing the station's system malfunctions and conducting scientific experiments. However, due to the collapse of the Soviet Union, no funding was available for sending the necessary Soyuz spacecraft to bring Krikalev back to Earth. The spacecraft that was supposed to bring Krikalev and the other cosmonauts back could not be launched until very late, due to budget constraints in Russia's space program. This uncertainty had an impact on Krikalev's morale. Being alone in space, with no news from Earth, and with no idea when his return journey would take place, made the situation incredibly difficult. The isolation Krikalev experienced was not only a physical separation, but also a psychological burden. The effects of spending such a long time in space were both physically and mentally challenging. Krikalev had no idea how time was passing, and he waited patiently every day, dreaming of returning to Earth. When Krikalev was stranded in space, he was cut off from the other people on Earth. Indeed, his situation turned into a story of a person who was, in a way, lost in space. While Earth was rapidly changing with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Krikalev was unable to witness any part of this great transformation. Everything in space was different. The return process was uncertain, and Krikalev was not only deprived of hope for his return, but every day presented a new challenge. He not only had to maintain the Mir station and take care of his health, but he also wondered how the new government would handle the Soviet Union's space legacy. During this time, the uncertainty on Earth deepened Krikalev's isolation. In space, he wasn't just an engineer maintaining the station's technical infrastructure, but a person who had completely disconnected from Earth and felt loneliness on a deeper level as the days went by. Throughout his time in space, Krikalev not only continued his scientific work but also had an experience that allowed him to explore the limits of how much time a person could spend in space. The difficulty of sending the necessary Soyuz spacecraft for his return placed Krikalev in a truly unique position in history. The story of a person stranded in space didn't just show how advanced technology and space programs had become, but also demonstrated the immense capacity for human resilience and patience. During his time on the Mir space station, Krikalev faced not only physical challenges but also psychological ones. His time in space, initially planned as a few months-long mission, extended far beyond that due to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the limited budget allocated by Russia's new government for space programs. This long duration brought Krikalev into an unprecedented living condition, a constant battle to cope with stress, isolation, and uncertainty. Extended stays in space have various negative effects on the human body. Krikalev and other cosmonauts faced issues such as muscle atrophy and decreased bone density due to prolonged weightlessness. This was one of the most noticeable and physiological effects of being in space. This situation became a process that challenged Krikalev both physically and mentally. Krikalev's mission was not only to conduct scientific experiments, but also to maintain the infrastructure of the Mir space station. Mir, which had been constructed by the Soviet Union in the 1980s, was designed for long-term space missions. However, over time, maintaining its aging systems and fixing malfunctions became increasingly difficult. The station's electrical systems, oxygen production, and other essential infrastructure issues were challenges Krikalev and his fellow cosmonauts faced daily. Sustaining basic needs like food, water, and oxygen became the biggest issue for Krikalev and the other crew members. These resources were often limited, and the station's supplies began running low when the shipments ran out. In the cramped living quarters of the Mir station, everything had to be managed in an extremely organized manner. Continuous planning was required, especially for the recycling of water and efficient use of food. Otherwise, the depletion of these resources could jeopardize Krikalev and the other cosmonauts' survival. Each part of the station was like a machine that needed meticulous attention every day. Power outages, oxygen levels, water purification, and other essential functions were elements that Krikalev constantly monitored and worked to correct. The physically demanding tasks could have affected Krikalev and the other crew members' health, but under these conditions, there was only one solution: to be patient and carry out the tasks without interruption. In addition to dealing with physical challenges, Krikalev was also fighting a significant psychological battle. Cosmonauts sent to space often face severe psychological issues due to their disconnection from Earth and long-term isolation. Krikalev's situation was no different. As days passed, he had to cope with feelings of loneliness, the inability to track time, and getting lost in uncertainty. Communication with Earth had been severed. Krikalev was unaware of the massive political uncertainties following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the formation of Russia's new government. For D, a person stranded in space receiving no news from Earth, meant not just physical isolation but mental isolation as well. Krikalev had lost contact with his family, friends, and life on Earth. His social interactions were limited to the other cosmonauts aboard the Mir station, which was not enough to alleviate his sense of loneliness. Perceiving the passage of time was a significant challenge for Krikalev. In the space environment, where the distinction between day and night was lost, the flow of time was very uncertain. Far away from Earth, living alone, Krikalev continued his life in a daily routine that never changed. Under this psychological pressure, maintaining his morale was not only a personal strength but also critical for the team's overall success. While Krikalev was stranded on the Mir space station, he had no information about the collapse of the Soviet Union. This event shook the political balance on Earth, and while Krikalev was stranded in space, he could not establish any connection with Earth. The collapse of the Soviet Union marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. The impact of these changes affected not only Russia's internal operations, but also its space program. As the newly established Russian government reorganized the space program, they faced significant difficulties in launching the spacecraft needed for Krikalev's return and providing logistical support. Krikalev had to focus on his mission without hope of returning to Earth in this uncertain environment. The collapse of the Soviet Union had also severed his connection with Earth, but Krikalev continued to work toward completing his mission, aware of his responsibilities. Throughout the time Krikalev was stranded in space, he demonstrated not only physical, but also mental resilience. The long-term isolation put a heavy mental strain on him. With no information on when he would be able to return, this uncertainty gradually evolved into a crisis. During this period, Krikalev had to develop several strategies to maintain his mental health. At times, he found motivation by focusing on small victories while carrying out his duties. Other times, he hoped to survive this period by simply maintaining his physical health. Each day became more challenging than the last. However, Krikalev patiently carried out his tasks, trying to overcome the difficulties. Both the physical and psychological battles made this period unforgettable. His determination was not only a personal achievement, but also an example of humanity's ability to survive in the most difficult conditions in space. Sergei Krikalev, along with the collapse of the Soviet Union, not only found himself physically alone in space, but the communication networks with Earth also began to sever one by one. The dissolution of the Soviet Union created great uncertainty, leading to Krikalev's prolonged isolation and lack of communication with Earth. The Soviet space program was severely affected by the country's major economic and political changes, and this caused repeated delays in the plans for Krikalev's return. While Krikalev continued his mission aboard the Mir space station, the collapse of the Soviet Union had profound effects, not only on domestic politics but also on the functioning of the space program. For years, the Soviet Union had made significant investments in space research, sending numerous cosmonauts into space. However, when the Soviet Union officially dissolved at the end of 1991, the space program was plunged into uncertainty. Although the newly formed Russian government took over the Soviet Union's former space agency, the country's economic crisis severely limited spending on space exploration. These constraints led to an unexpected extension of Krikalev's time in space. Initially planned as a 3-month mission, it gradually extended month after month. During this time, Krikalev received no information about the collapse of the Soviet Union or the newly established Russian space program. In space, there was no way to receive news from Earth. This situation not only affected Krikalev, but also deeply impacted the other cosmonauts aboard Mir. They had lost their connection to Earth and were, in a sense, cut off from the world. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it became increasingly difficult for Krikalev to get any information from Earth. In space, communication systems were quite limited. While contact with the Mir station was occasionally possible, the connections were weak and focused solely on technical data related to the station's operations. After the dissolution of the Soviet government, Krikalev had to rely on these systems, which were used only as a tool for maintaining communication with Earth. This was the beginning of a period of great uncertainty for Krikalev. Krikalev had to focus solely on his mission, maintaining the station and conducting scientific work. However, as days passed and his connection to Earth weakened with no news, he began to struggle mentally. He was alone in space, with no knowledge of what was happening on Earth. Getting any news about the collapse of the Soviet Union became impossible. Without knowledge of which government was in power, what policies were being implemented, or how the economy and social situation had changed, Krikalev was completely cut off from the world. Krikalev's time aboard the Mir station was initially planned for 3 months. However, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the space program and the plans for his return were thrown into great uncertainty. The newly formed Russian government could not allocate sufficient budget for space exploration. The funding and resources necessary to launch the Soyuz spacecraft for Krikalev's return could not be secured. All these financial difficulties further delayed Krikalev's return to Earth. Day by day, Krikalev remained stranded aboard the Mir space station. As his connection to Earth weakened, Krikalev and the other cosmonauts were left to focus solely on carrying out their duties and maintaining the technical operations of the station. Yet, an internal sense of emptiness began to develop. Krikalev spent his days not knowing how the world was changing, what decisions the new government was making, or how the collapse of the Soviet Union was affecting the people. This long-term isolation, which began as a mission, gradually became something resembling a kind of imprisonment. Unable to receive news from Earth, Krikalev sought ways to cope with the uncertainty he was living in. He chose to be patient, remain committed to his mission, and keep the hope of returning alive with each passing day. This was not only a physical but also a mental struggle. As it became increasingly difficult to perceive the passage of time, Krikalev treated each day as an opportunity to move one step forward. The weakening of his connection to Earth required him not only to remain patient, but also to make sound decisions during the toughest moments. In the midst of this uncertainty, Krikalev, along with his teammates, continued to maintain the operations of the Mir station. However, with each passing day, the feeling of being disconnected from the world and not having the opportunity to return was increasing the psychological and moral challenges. For Krikalev, it was incredibly difficult to start each day with hope, only to accept the uncertainty of his return when the evening came. Yet, Krikalev's mission was not only about scientific achievements but also about maintaining his mental resilience under these challenging conditions. Above all, for Krikalev, surviving and completing his mission gave him the hope of reconnecting with Earth. Amidst this uncertainty, Krikalev continued to patiently carry out his mission. Although the hope of returning seemed like a distant dream, Krikalev's determination, belief in completing his mission, and disciplined approach never wavered. His connection to Earth may have been lost, but for Krikalev, this was not an obstacle to continuing his work. Every moment spent in space not only made him a cosmonaut, but also a figure proving humanity's resilience against the toughest conditions. Patient, determined, and committed to his mission, this journey became not just a fight for one man's survival, but also a way to make history. The loss of contact with Earth gradually became an accepted reality for Sergei Krikalev. However, his return would be more than just a mission. It would be a victory, demonstrating his ability to overcome these hardships and showing the strength of the human spirit. Krikalev's space journey is recorded as one of the most challenging and dramatic space missions in history. The mission, which began in 1991, lasted much longer than anticipated. Amidst the collapse of the Soviet Union and the uncertainty faced by Russia's new government, Krikolev's time in space spanned 311 days. This period was not only a personal struggle for Krikalev, but also a key moment demonstrating humanity's endurance in space and the impact of the Soviet Union's collapse on its space program. Krikalev was sent into space in May 1991, during the final years of the Soviet Union, to work aboard the Mir space station. His mission was to contribute to international scientific research and oversee the station's systems. However, when Krikalev was sent into space, he had no idea that the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. The fall of the Soviet Union created great uncertainty for both Krikalev and the future of the Mir space station. The Soviet government soon began to struggle with financing the space program, and plans for Krikalev's return were never realized. Contact with Earth slowly faded, and Krikalev had to cope with the uncertainty of his return date. Krikalev's 311 days in space became one of the longest space missions in history, although it was initially planned to last only 3 months. The collapse of the Soviet Union, followed by economic and political crises, made Krikalev's return impossible. Every day, Krikalev and the other cosmonauts aboard Mir fought for survival, dealing with food, oxygen production, water supply, and repairing the station's malfunctioning systems. With no communication with Earth, Krikalev continued his mission, searching for a glimmer of hope for his return. During this time, one of Krikalev's biggest challenges was loneliness and isolation. Without any knowledge of the collapse of the Soviet Union or the new Russian government, Krikalev had to focus solely on his mission. Over the time spent in space, he grew physically weaker but mentally stronger. Each day, as he maintained the aging station, he created a form of resistance against the uncertainty surrounding him. The loss of communication with Earth made it difficult for him to keep track of time. However, through his loyalty and determination, he managed to push forward every single day. Krikalev's return finally became possible in 1992. The new Russian government allocated more resources to the space program and decided to launch the Soyuz spacecraft. Krikalev waited for the only available spacecraft. However, this process was not only technically challenging, but also psychologically taxing. He had lost contact with Earth and had not been able to follow developments on the planet. The collapse of the Soviet Union had thrown his life, family, and friends into uncertainty. When the return date was finally confirmed, Krikalev's 311 days in space set a record and became one of the longest periods anyone had ever spent in space, ensuring his place in space history. In March 1992, Krikalev and the other cosmonauts aboard Mir boarded the Soyuz spacecraft and began their journey back to Earth. During his time in space, his body had weakened due to the microgravity environment. As they descended back to Earth, Krikalev's physical health had deteriorated significantly due to the effects of the long space journey. After landing slowly, Krikalev faced a challenging recovery process. His body functions had slowed, and he had lost muscle and bone density. However, despite these hardships, Krikalev managed to return safely. His return also held great significance for Russia. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the future of Russia's space program was uncertain. Krikalev's return became a symbol of continuity and success for Russia's space program. At the same time, as a reflection of the collapse of the Soviet Union, it became clear that the crises within the space program needed to be addressed, and that a process of restructuring had to begin. Krikalev's mission and return had become a symbol of this new order. Krikalev's time in space revealed the dramatic impact of the Soviet Union's collapse on the space program. The Soviet space program had been one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century. However, with the collapse, these successes were now seriously threatened. Amidst this great transformation happening all over the world, Krikalev turned into a personal hero. The challenges he faced during his time in space were not only an individual struggle, but also a reflection of a global political shift. Krikolev's story demonstrated how space posed a tough test for the human spirit and determination while also shedding light on the effects of the collapse of the Soviet Union on the world. Krikalev returned with the new support provided by Russia's new government for its space program, but the time he spent in space not only brought him scientific achievements, it also pushed the boundaries of humanity's ability to survive in space. Krikolev's return to Earth was not just a personal victory, but also a rebirth for Russia. The space program would undergo a major transformation after the collapse of the Soviet Union, evolving into a more modern, internationally collaborative structure. Krikalev became part of this transformation and symbolized Russia's new space program. Furthermore, Krikalev would go down in history as a name that emphasized the importance of surviving in space and the resilience against challenges. Krikalev's return was a symbol not only of space exploration, but also of political and social changes around the world. The collapse of the Soviet Union was a turning point for both Russia and the world. With his 301 days spent in space, Krikalev became not only an important part of space history, but also a symbol of new beginnings, challenges, and survival for humanity.